Did you ever hear the tragedy of Star Wars 1313?
No.
I thought not. It's not a story that Disney would tell you. It's an E3 legend. LucasArts was a publisher, so powerful and so wise, they could use the Star Wars universe to influence the developers to create games. They had such a knowledge of the expanded universe, they could even keep the franchises they loved from dying. But the dark underbelly of Coruscant is a setting that some consider to be non-canon. LucasArts made Star Wars 1313 generate so much hype. The only thing they were afraid of was losing that hype, which eventually, of course, they did.
Unfortunately,
LucasArts catered to the needs and demands of George Lucas, but then George Lucas sold the franchise to Disney.
ironic.
They could please the one who created them, but not their new owner. When I think of what the longest running game series with the most entries in it could be, the top two that come to my mind are Star Wars and Mario. Both of these titans of industry have had their names written across hundreds of games, and have been around since the early mid-80s. Although the franchise's influence in pop culture has at times seemed unparalleled, there is one tale that shows the series in a much different light. A tale where the strength of the Star Wars name and brand totally failed. We might have 37 years of Star Wars video games to look back on and enjoy, but no amount of time can bring back the things we never got. The history of Star Wars 1313 isn't pretty. It's a tale of higher management interference, internal politics, clashing ideas, and a company struggling to prove their worth against the odds. Star Wars 1313 is a tragedy in the truest sense of the word. Okay, it wasn't literally on the same level as Hurricane Katrina or the Space Shuttle Challenger, but in the minds of hyperbolic and passionate gamers, it sure felt like it. With this video, I hope to educate you a little on the history of Star Wars video games, and maybe give you a deeper appreciation for them. In order to fully understand the level of tragedy we're talking about here, to know why the game doesn't exist, we need to take a brief look back at where LucasArts came from, what position the studio was in back then, and what Star Wars 1313 meant to the developers.
I'm in both businesses. I'm in the game business. I've been in the game business for 15 years. We've been developing interactive multimedia entertainment.
During the late 70s and early 80s, when Pong and pinball were mere distractions at pizza shops, there weren't many major filmmakers in Hollywood who took an interest in this new media, and those that were considering expansion probably abandoned ship when the crash of 1983 happened.
I've seen the final game.
Are you happy with it?
Oh yeah, it's my favorite. Of course I'm biased, I made the movie.
But there was one man who had plans to merchandise his work in any way possible. He had the foresight to see into the future.
It is the future you see.
And predict how wildly successful video games would be. That man's name? Al George Ein Lucas. George Lucas licensed the rights of Star Wars video games and made deals with multiple developers. He then created his own developer branch, the lesser-known Lucasfilm Games. Over the years, this studio would develop plenty of games and explore new intellectual properties. It's still funny to think that Atari had so much power back then. They even had licensing rights to Star Wars. For a time.
In a galaxy of video games, there is only one. Star Wars, the arcade game.
That is, until 1990, when the studio was restructured and changed. The company was reborn, rebranded, and the iconic crown-holding golden man we know today. LucasArts would be given a permanent seat on the Jedi Council, and naturally the rank of Master too. It's quite obvious from their name that LucasArts would ultimately have to bend the knee to George, no matter the situation, no matter how preposterous and inconvenient his ideas might be, or how ignorant he was of how games were actually made. George was a filmmaker, not a game producer, and the mediums don't transition into each other so fluidly. Whenever George made demands, they were met. As was the case with the less than perfect prequel films,
I don't like sand.
George Lucas would have complete control of the games and their narrative directions, although he wasn't nearly as involved and would more or less pop out of the woodwork to give certain instructions. He did, however, give the studio a lot of overall freedom with their projects.
We could bounce ideas off of him. He could tell us, nah, I wouldn't go there, but did you ever think about this? Or, hey, why don't you create this new character, which was fantastic because all of a sudden that opened up the canon for us.
Yes, gamers watched their career with great interest, and throughout the 90s, LucasArts would make a name for themselves, acting as both a developer and publisher. Quite a respectable combination. They blasted out hits such as Super Star Wars, Dark Forces, Shadows of the Empire, Jedi Knight, Rogue Squadron, and so many others. They even dabbled in Indiana Jones games, and the company had established an immense library throughout the years. During the 90s, LucasArts was viewed as a colossus of Star Wars games and the industry itself. But at the turn of the century, something changed, and that golden man started to more closely resemble a company who published popular games instead of making them. You can't necessarily blame BioWare and Pandemic for busting out two of the greatest Star Wars games of all time, and maybe that started to turn people's attention away from LucasArts and to other companies. Between these years, the studio only had their hands on 4 Star Wars games, with Republic Commando being the last Star Wars video game they developed entirely on their own. LucasArts also contracted what I like to call the Cleveland Brown syndrome, a disease wherein an organization cannot find long-term stability within its most important position. Simon Jeffrey, Jim Ward, Daryl Rodriguez, and Paul Meegan. These were the 4 presidents of the company between 2000 and 2010. When development of a game can take years and suffer unforeseen setbacks, you certainly want everyone in the studio to be on the same page, especially with the higher-ups, which is nearly impossible when you swap out presidents mid-development, and this new guy wants to come in and make sweeping changes, which they all did, and as a result, the studio was subjected to several massive layoffs, game cancellations, and shifting of the staff. Amongst programmers and game developers, LucasArts garnered a reputation as having something of a curse. They could more or less be summed up as a young rising star during the 90s, who slowly lost his way and relevance over time in the 2000s, but in the 2010s would plan a fantastic comeback. LucasArts had been looking forward to this, a chance to prove their powers had doubled since we last met, and take back their role as one of the prime developers in the industry. But a great comeback requires a great game, and that is where we arrive at Star Wars 1313, codename Underworld. The sales pitch for Underworld was initially as a tie-in with a live-action TV series of the same name that George Lucas had been working on, which ironically enough also fell through, because of an insane budget of $5 million per episode.
It's just that we can't figure out a way of doing it for less than $50 million an episode.
$5 million.
$50 million.
$5 million.
$50 million.
Gungans.
Gungas.
Gungans.
Gungas.
I wanted to ask about Star Wars Underworld. Is that completely gone, or is it possible that The Force Awakens could kind of bring that back into
It's so
focus?
funny that people keep asking me about this. Star Wars Underworld was the series I briefly worked on. I have no idea. It's all, the entire Star Wars thing got sold to Disney, so it's over in the house of the mouse, and whatever they want to do with it is what they're going to do with it, and I've heard nothing, so I don't know.
But both the TV series and game would be a far cry from the typical happy-go-lucky good versus evil stories we've come to expect from Star Wars. No, Underworld the game would be about crime families, violence, and the seedy underbelly of Coruscant.
You will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy.
Named after the 1,313th level of the planet, Underworld would go for a more gritty, dark, mature tone, somewhat like Republic Commando. It would make a fine addition to the collection of Star Wars video games. The expanded material in games had always done a great job of fleshing out the world of Star Wars where the films might have failed. We never really got an understanding of what Coruscant was like as a planet. All we really had from the films was a bunch of diplomatic scenes, and one mass murdering spree. And with Underworld, it would be a fantastic opportunity to get to know what really goes on beneath Coruscant, one of the most important settings in the Star Wars universe. And it wouldn't just be another Jedi, Sith, Force power, lightsaber-oriented game. No. This was going to be something new. During their talks with George, the negotiations were short. And in order to get anything done with the story, LucasArts would first need approval from the big man himself, which required them to go through several film executives just to get an audience with George, and they likely didn't know much about video games. A lack of proper communication between LucasArts and George would radically shake the foundation the game was built on, and nobody wanted to make a mess of things in front of the legend himself. Underworld would go through several big idea changes throughout its development, from being a Gears of War style co-op game with cover shooting mechanics, to a revival of the Battlefront series, and for a month or two had even been planned as a Grand Theft Auto clone. Yeah, that's right. But LucasArts had many assets at their disposal that most developers would dream of. Number 1, an owner who wanted to morph the technology of film with that of video games.
One is not going to wipe out the other. They will coexist. People will always want to have a story told to them. And they will like to play games where you don't know the outcome and where you have some control over the outcome. I think there'll be movies and there'll be games. And the games will look like movies.
Tail Blue 2, watch the rear.
LucasArts had access to tons of high-powered equipment and was working with Industrial Light and Magic, a company known for producing special effects for the original Star Wars film, as well as numerous other massive Hollywood productions.
You know, we literally had people rolling off the Avengers and a week later coming onto the team and staying with us.
In addition, full motion capture would be used to make the characters and dialogue appear more realistic. LA Noire certainly captured audiences in 2011, proving such advanced technology could work wonders in a video game. It was always the dream of the team and George to use the power of filmmaking to make the game much more cinematic than any Star Wars game had ever been before. With the success of the Uncharted series, LucasArts finally settled on making Underworld an Uncharted-style Star Wars game, an action-adventure experience that would utilize the greatest aspects of filmmaking to service the story. With their direction in place, the next step was gameplay, which would be simple, or so they thought.
You are looking at the first screenshot of the next Star Wars game. Really? Trust me. Get excited. Yeah? Liar!
E3 is often a time of feast or famine, where game companies vie for control and attention of gamers and the world alike. Hundreds of thousands of man-hours, thousands of employees, years of work, all consolidated into a 3-day showcase extravaganza. LucasArts was more focused and prepared than ever. They figured out that Star Wars 13 would let the player control a bounty hunter as they track down criminals using various gadgets, which is a pretty dope basis for the gameplay, don't you think? As time went on, George would allow the team to use more and more of his universe, and even allowed 1313 to be a canon Star Wars story. It was also planned to be a launch title for the Xbox One and PS4, which had both not yet been announced or revealed. During the lead-up to E3 2012, the pressure was on. LucasArts wanted to make a statement with this game and regain their old status. But it all just turned out to be a wild bantha chase. What LucasArts hadn't noticed was George's shields were still up, and he was willing to change his mind on a dime with little consideration for how it would affect development, which he so did when he told them that 1313's main character would not be someone new that they had already created, gotten voice actors for, paid those voice actors and had them record their lines. No, scrap all that work. This game's about Boba Fett now.
I hate it when he does that.
2 months, literally 2 months, before showcasing their project to the world, LucasArts was in disarray, scrambling for order. They had a whole story planned, a protagonist they created, gameplay based around that protagonist, and now they would have to scrap so much of that just to accommodate George's request, and you couldn't say no to him after his mind was made up. Probably because they had no time to prepare for this new direction, LucasArts was also forbidden to talk about Boba Fett at E3.
Can I be Boba Fett? That's the question, first question.
That's a great question. Yeah, no, we're not quite ready to talk about who you're actually going to be.
Which meant that the trailers we saw were going to have little to nothing to do with the end product. And then, the day finally came. Star Wars 1313 was the talk of the town. The gameplay looked intense, the graphics were breathtaking, the cutscenes and story pulled us all in, motion capture made it feel real, and the developer interviews satisfied our curiosity to know more. It was a time of celebration, inside and out of LucasArts. Following the immense praise, new staff was hired on, the project expanded, and the studio was running on all 4 cylinders. Everyone was jacked up. But momentum soon shifted towards the dark side. For some reason, in September 2012, Lucasfilm, their parent company, put a freeze on LucasArts' hiring process. The president, Paul Megan, had just quit, and the team was sitting there, treading water. It would be a while before we heard any substantial news on Star Wars 1313, and it wouldn't be good. When Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, came out in 2005, fan reactions were highly mixed. While hardcore critics would point out the various flaws in filmmaking or suck off George Lucas, the fan base's toxicity levels around this franchise had reached an all-time high. The argument on the quality of the prequels is a different discussion entirely, but no matter how you felt about the films, nobody felt worse than George.
I may have gone too far in a few places.
He was traumatized by the feedback his films had gotten, and this, along with many other factors, prompted him to make a blockbuster move, the likes of which we will never see again and have never seen since. Tired of the business, fan animosity, and contemplating retirement, on October 30th, 2012, George Lucas officially passed the torch and sold Star Wars to Disney for $4 billion. At first, everyone was confused, but then reassured by Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, who told the world that Disney would be licensing Star Wars video games to other developers and publishers. Everyone was kind of reassured that things would progress as normal, except LucasArts. And Bob also gave everyone a red flag when he stated that Disney was more focused on exploring mobile and casual games as well as producing more films. Bob told LucasArts that they would operate as usual, but many employees felt uneasy. It's unavoidable that a franchise is going to undergo massive changes when sold for $4 billion. Disney is not going to have the same motives as George Lucas. Some employees left LucasArts, others stayed on board, believing that nothing and nobody could possibly underestimate the potential of Star Wars 1313 and the hype it generated at E3. There was no way this game was going to get canned.
I've got a bad feeling about this.
I have a bad feeling about this.
I got a bad feeling about this.
Oh, I have a bad feeling about this.
And on April 3rd, 2013, Disney executed Order 66, shut down LucasArts completely. It was final.
You were my brother!
LucasArts.
I loved you!
Following the shutdown and the layoff of 150 employees, and not comfortable with taking huge risks on bigger picture ideas, Disney put the final nail in the coffin by ceasing production of Star Wars 1313. Disney would trudge on though, and further upset the fans and gamers by signing an exclusive deal with none other than the 2-time consecutive winner of the Worst Company in America award. Ladies and gentlemen, Electronic Arts.
Boo! You stink!
Begun, the loot box war had. Which leaves us where we are now, in a sort of what the fuck happened situation. Fans have been starved for new Star Wars games, but EA holds the licensing rights, and no matter how badly they fuck it up, it seems they will retain that position. The saying, "you don't know what you got till it's gone," rings especially true to me with Star Wars. Yeah, George had floundered with the prequels and had merchandised the ever-loving shit out of Star Wars, but he also had a knack for giving fans all sorts of complimentary media outside of the films. Under his rule, Star Wars flourished, with so many memorable, awesome games, 2 animated Clone Wars TV series, and so much more. Both Disney and George have released films that were polarizing and divisive amongst fans, but with 6 years under their belt, Disney has only managed to release 2 non-mobile games, one of which sparked an entire debate about the legality of loot boxes. This is the company they went with over LucasArts. There is no question, George handled this franchise way better than Disney has, and LucasArts was an extension of him. Ironic that Jedi Fallen Order bears some resemblance to Star Wars 1313. Guess we'll have to wait and see if they can deliver a kick-ass experience with that. Games are cancelled all the time, for various reasons. Sometimes an idea is too ambitious, the staff is inexperienced, or upper management meddles with the project. Sometimes a hyped-up game is stuck in development hell for years, only to come out and disappoint immensely, or never be fully acknowledged at all by its company. Whatever the case might be, I don't think there will ever be another game that so vigorously dashed the hopes and dreams of gamers like this. Star Wars 1313 and the shutdown of LucasArts was so tragic because nobody ever expected such an influential studio and one of the most anticipated games of the last few years to be shut down out of the blue, and all their projects tossed in the trash. The worst part of it is LucasArts never got the chance to redeem themselves. And though the employees might have moved on to other jobs, bigger and better things, I can only imagine that the way they left this game has left a permanent hole in their hearts. Nobody expected George Lucas to hand over the Star Wars IP just like that, and nobody expected the tragedy of Star Wars 1313.